Your tooth has been throbbing for 3 days. Not aching, throbbing. A hot pulse that keeps time with your heartbeat, that wakes you in the dark, that turns one whole side of your mouth into a place you don't chew anymore. It's cold outside. It's green. And it is thousands of years before anyone will bother to write the word toothache down. There's no cabinet to open. No pharmacy glowing at the end of the street at 2 in the morning. No little white pill with a cross stamped into it. And definitely no website standing by to tell you your symptoms mean either nothing at all or something with a Latin name and a very short life expectancy. There's just you, the pain, and whatever happens to grow within walking distance. So what do you actually do? The easy assumption is nothing. You grit your teeth, bad phrasing, under the circumstances, and you wait and you hope, and maybe you chew on a random stick and mutter at the sky. That's the version most of us carry around. Ancient people in pain, essentially helpless, standing on the wrong side of a very long wait for anyone to invent a cure. But the real question underneath all of this is stranger than, did it hurt? The question is whether the person with the throbbing tooth knew something, whether the plants around them were just scenery, or whether they were a kind of unwritten pharmacy that a person could actually reach into. Did ancient humans have their own secret cures? Real ones, ones that worked? And if they did, how good were they really? Because the answer turns out to be a lot less shaking a stick at the moon, and a lot more, wait, they had what? Look, the picture most of us default to is basically a cartoon. Ancient medicine means a robed figure waving a bundle of smoking herbs at a fever, chanting, prescribing the powdered gland of one very specific frog, ideally at midnight. Leeches, bloodletting. Someone confidently recommending you drink mercury and get some rest. It's the medical version of assuming your distant ancestors spent their whole lives baffled by the concept of a door. And some of that reputation is fair, honestly. A lot of old medicine was nonsense, and a decent chunk of it was nonsense that actively made things worse. But that cartoon is hiding something, and once you see what it's hiding, you can't really go back to the cartoon. We've all been handed a very clean story about medicine, and the story only moves in one direction, up. It starts, depending on who's telling it, with the Greeks, with Hippocrates, around 2,500 years ago, setting the gods aside and treating the body as just a body. Before that, superstition and incense. After that, a slow heroic climb through the centuries, the microscope, the germ theory, the double-blind trial, and finally us, the lucky generation, standing at the top of the ladder looking down at everybody who came before. And that's a reasonable thing to believe. Most textbooks tell it roughly that way, and they're not lying to you. A huge amount of ancient medicine really was useless. Bloodletting killed people for centuries. Mercury was a prescription. The full list of things our ancestors put in their bodies with total confidence, that we now store in a locked box with a skull drawn on the front, is genuinely long. But there's a crack in that tidy story, and it runs deeper than it wants to admit. Because if ancient medicine was really just fear and lucky guessing, you'd expect it to fall apart the moment you test it. You'd expect to carry an old remedy into a modern lab, run it against real bacteria or a real parasite, and watch it do absolutely nothing. And sometimes, sure, that's exactly what happens. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the old remedy walks into the lab, sits down next to the 21st century, and does something that makes the scientists go quiet. And the timeline where that keeps happening doesn't politely begin with the Greeks. It doesn't begin with writing at all. It runs down underneath the first cities, underneath the first farms, underneath the first anything you'd find in a history book, into a stretch of time so deep it stops being human history and turns into something older than our species. That's the part the clean story leaves out. And to get to it, you have to care, briefly and intensely, about dental plaque. Stay with me, because that hardened gunk your dentist scrapes off your teeth is about to become the most important substance in this entire video. Plaque is a fossil in progress. While you're alive, it's just quietly trapping everything that passes through your mouth. Food, bacteria, pollen, the chemical ghost of whatever you were chewing. and then it mineralizes and locks all of it in place. For tens of thousands of years, if the conditions are right. It's a time capsule nobody meant to build, welded to the teeth of the dead, waiting for someone with the right machine to come along and pry it open. Someone did. A team led by Laura Weyrich at the Australian Centre for Ancient DNA took the plaque off the teeth of 5 individuals from a cave called El Cedron in northern Spain and sequenced what was inside. And here's the first jolt. These weren't early humans. They were Neanderthals. A different kind of human entirely, dead for somewhere between 47 and 50,000 years. To put that number where your ear can feel it, that's before the painted caves at Lascaux, before farming, before our own species had even finished spreading across the planet. Deep, deep time. One of these individuals was sick. You can read it right off the jawbone. A dental abscess. The kind of deep infection that turns every meal into a negotiation with pain. His plaque showed he was also hosting an intestinal parasite, the sort that produces the kind of gut trouble nobody describes at dinner. So picture a Neanderthal, genuinely miserable, tens of thousands of years before anyone could offer him a single word of comfort. And in his plaque, they found poplar. Poplar contains salicylic acid. Salicylic acid is the active ingredient in aspirin. In the same mouth, they found traces of penicillium, the mold that would, roughly 40,000 years later, hand a distracted scientist named Fleming the first real antibiotic. Let the shape of that settle for a second. A sick individual carrying the painkiller for his pain, and quite possibly the antibiotic mold for his infection. Not a member of our species. Tens of thousands of years before the words aspirin or penicillin would exist to be spoken. The two compounds sitting at the absolute foundation of modern medicine, found together in the mouth of a Neanderthal with a bad tooth. The careful version, because it matters. The researchers were the first to say you can't prove he understood any of it. And a bit of mold on old food isn't a prescription. Fair enough, but the poplar isn't food. It's bitter, it's medicinal. Nobody's eating it for the flavor. And it happens to target the exact thing that was hurting him. That's an awful lot of coincidence to pin on one very unlucky, or one quietly resourceful individual. And the reason it stops looking like a coincidence is that the same cave had already handed over a matching clue. A few years earlier, another team, led by Karen Hardy, an archaeologist who has spent much of her career reading the chemistry locked inside ancient teeth, had pulled apart the plaque of other El Cedron Neanderthals and found yarrow and chamomile. Both plants are bitter. Both are close to worthless as food. And both have been used by humans for as long as we can trace it to calm an inflamed gut and take the edge off a fever. 2 separate studies. One cave. The same quiet conclusion creeping up on everyone. These individuals were selecting specific plants for what the plants did to a sick body, not for how they tasted or how they filled a stomach. Still, if you really wanted to, you could squint at 2 studies from one Spanish cave and call it a local fluke. So jump forward to a body that still has skin on it. In 1991, 2 hikers in the Alps found a corpse thawing out of a glacier and assumed they'd stumbled on some unlucky modern climber. What they'd actually found was a man who died around 3,300 BC, more than 5,000 years ago, frozen so completely that scientists could later reconstruct his last meals, his illnesses, and, as it turned out, his medicine kit. Everyone calls him Otzi. Threaded onto leather cords among his belongings were lumps of a fungus called birch polypore. It is not food, it tastes like a punishment. What it does have is antiparasitic and antibacterial properties. And when researchers examined Ötzi's gut, they found whipworm, an intestinal parasite. This man was carrying, strung onto his gear like any other tool, something that fights the precise thing that was living inside him. That is not a snack grabbed by accident on a bad afternoon. That's a person who knew he was sick and packed accordingly. A 5,000-year-old first aid kit, worn on the body because that's exactly what it was. It's the same instinct as the little travel pouch where you keep the ibuprofen and the stuff for an unhappy stomach, just without the shrink wrap and the tiny unreadable insert. And Otzi had one more thing. 61 tattoos. Most of them not decoration at all, but small marks clustered over his joints and lower back. The parts of a body that ache after a hard life in the mountains. They line up startlingly well with the pressure points a modern acupuncturist would use for exactly those complaints, and they predate the earliest known acupuncture in China by around 2,000 years. A man in the Copper Age, mapping his own pain onto his own skin and treating it. Once people start writing, the guesswork starts leaving receipts. The Egyptians wrote their medicine down in documents like the Ebers Papyrus over 3,000 years ago. And one remedy they wrote down again and again was honey. They packed it straight into open wounds. And here's what they couldn't have known in those words, but clearly understood in practice. Honey is a genuinely hostile place for bacteria. It pulls the water right out of them, and it's naturally acidic, so microbes essentially shrivel and die in it. The Egyptian healers didn't have the term antibacterial. They just knew from watching that a wound dressed in honey turned septic far less often than one left bare. And the tell that this wasn't dumb luck is simple. We never stopped. Walk into a hospital burn unit today, and there's a real chance the dressings coming off the shelf are medical-grade honey. Same substance, same reason. More than 3,000 years apart. A remedy that traveled from a scroll in a tomb to a sterilized packet in a wound care ward, and never once failed badly enough for us to throw it away. Most of what humans have believed about anything doesn't survive that kind of test. This did. The next one goes further, because it's a case where the ancient text was flat out smarter than the modern scientists, and the only way forward was for them to admit it. In the 1960s, malaria was outrunning the drugs meant to stop it, killing people faster than the medicine cabinet could answer. And a secret Chinese military research effort. It was so classified, it went by a number, Project 523, started hunting for something new. Conventional chemistry had already been thrown at the problem, hundreds of thousands of compounds screened and discarded, with basically nothing to show for it. So they went looking in an unglamorous place instead. Old medical manuscripts. A scientist named Tu Youyou led a team that worked through more than 2,000 traditional recipes and tested hundreds of plant extracts. One after another, most of them going nowhere. One plant kept surfacing for fevers, sweet wormwood. They tested it, and it barely did anything. It looked like one more dead end on a pile of hundreds. Then Tu did the thing almost nobody thinks to do. She went back and reread the old instructions, a text roughly 1,600 years old, written by a man named Ge Hong. And she caught something everyone had skated past. The ancient recipe never said to boil the plant. It said to soak it in cold water and wring out the juice. Her team had been boiling it. The heat was cooking the one compound that actually worked. So she switched to a low-temperature extraction, ran the whole thing again, and this time the active ingredient came through intact. And it erased the malaria parasite in test after test. She was confident enough, or stubborn enough, to be one of the first humans to swallow it herself. That compound is artemisinin. Right now, today, it is the backbone of malaria treatment across the planet, and it has saved millions of lives, a fair share of them children. In 2015, it won Tu Youyou the Nobel Prize in medicine. And the key that finally opened the lock wasn't a new machine or a flash of modern genius. It was a 1,600-year-old note telling her, in effect, don't use heat. A single instruction that modern science had strolled straight past because it assumed it already knew better. Which drops us at the strangest case of all, the one that turns the whole neat ladder upside down and shakes it. There's a 1,000-year-old English medical book called Ball's Leech Book, sitting in the British Library, packed with precisely the kind of remedies you'd expect to smile at politely and move on from. One of them is a salve for an eye infection. The recipe calls for garlic, a second plant from the onion family, wine, and this is the ingredient that really sells the medieval mood. Bile taken from a cow's stomach. You mix it in a brass vessel, let it sit for exactly 9 days, and strain it through a cloth. An anglo-saxon specialist named Christina Lee at the University of Nottingham got curious about what would happen if someone actually built the thing and tested it properly, so she brought it to a team of microbiologists. They rebuilt the recipe as faithfully as they could manage, going as far as sourcing wine from a vineyard known to have existed back then. And then they dropped it onto one of the worst things a modern hospital deals with: MRSA, the antibiotic-resistant staph infection. The superbug that our own medicine helped breed by handing antibiotics out too freely for too long. The one that shrugs off drugs we invented in the last decade and keeps going. The 1,000-year-old cow bile eye goop killed up to 90% of it. The scientists said, in their own words, they were blown away because they'd expected a mild effect at best, and maybe nothing. And the part that should genuinely stop you is this: no single ingredient did the job. Garlic on its own, wine on its own, bile on its own, barely anything. It only worked as the complete recipe, combined in exactly the old proportions, in exactly the old way. Which means that some anglo-saxon healer 1,000 years ago had, through nothing but patient trial and error and a good memory, engineered a combination therapy that beats a modern drug-resistant superbug. Nobody taught them that. If anything, we're the ones getting schooled. And this isn't a cute historical footnote. We are right now slowly running out of working antibiotics. The resistant bugs are winning ground, and the pipeline of brand new drugs has thinned to a trickle. Which is why teams have started doing something that would have sounded absurd 20 years ago. Combing through medieval manuscripts on purpose, treating 1,000-year-old recipe books as a genuine place to go looking for the next real medicine. The future of fighting infection may partly involve reading very old handwriting. So here's where all of this lands, and it's probably within arm's reach of you right now. Go to your bathroom and open the cabinet. Somewhere in there is a bottle of aspirin, or ibuprofen, or something making a similar promise on the label. Pick it up. The thing quietly working inside that pill is salicylic acid, or a close chemical relative of it. The very same molecule that was sitting in the poplar a Neanderthal was chewing 48,000 years ago because his tooth was killing him, and he had figured out, somehow, across a gulf of time you can barely hold in your head, that this one bitter plant made it better. You are not doing something new when you take that pill. You're doing one of the oldest things there is. You're just the most recent person in a line that runs back past your own species. All of them looking around at whatever grew nearby. All of them trying to make the pain stop, and a startling number of them getting it exactly, chemically right. We love to tell ourselves the story where we invented all of it. Where medicine is something we dreamed up all on our own, and everyone before us was stuck down in the dark, waiting. But that's not what the plaque says. It's not what the man in the ice says, or the honey in the burn ward, or the Nobel Prize won by carefully rereading a note somebody wrote 16 centuries ago, or the cow bile salve that quietly embarrassed our best antibiotics. The secret cures were never really secret. They were inherited. Handed from one pair of hands to the next across an almost unimaginable stretch of time, half remembered, sometimes dropped and lost for centuries, and every so often picked back up by someone humble enough to go read the old instructions slowly. You didn't invent the honey you stir into tea when your throat is raw. You didn't invent any of it. You're just the current keeper of something very, very old. And most of us are carrying a piece of it without even noticing. Some remedy a grandparent swore by and passed down with total confidence and zero explanation. The one you still reach for now, without ever really asking why. So I'll leave you with this. What's the one your family handed you? The cure nobody ever proved, but nobody ever questioned either.